Some wounds don't bleed, they whisper, and they never stop. There are wounds you can't point to in the mirror. No blood, no bruises, no bandages, just a heaviness that settles somewhere behind the ribs, like something sacred was taken from you when you weren't looking. It doesn't scream, it lingers. It hums in your bones when the night is too quiet. And the worst part? No one sees it. You show up, you smile, you work. You reply, "I'm good," when someone asks. But deep down, you're carrying something that has no name, because the person who gave it to you never even admitted they did. That's the cruelty of emotional wounds. The ones left behind not by knives, but by neglect. Not by fists, but by silence. Not by honest mistakes, but by deliberate indifference. You weren't hit. You were abandoned. You weren't screamed at. You were erased. And somehow that hurts even more. Because how do you explain a pain caused by what wasn't said? How do you describe being hurt by something missing? A call that never came. A message left on read. A look that suddenly felt colder. A warmth that used to be there, now replaced by calculation. There's no funeral for that kind of death. No apology, no closure. Just the endless echo of what happened, bouncing through your chest at 3 a.m. But here's something you haven't been told enough. You are not crazy for feeling this. You are not weak for being affected by things others shrugged off. You are not dramatic for needing something they withheld. You're simply human. One who still believes connection should feel safe. One who still assumes love comes with care. One who never expected to be disposable. And yet, here you are, not broken, but bleeding inside a battle no one can see. So let's be honest with each other. If the pain wasn't your fault, then who's responsible for the healing? They caused the wound, yes, but they're not staying up at night reliving the moment. You are. They dismissed your truth, but you're the one still rehearsing it in your head, hoping someday they'll hear it differently. They moved on. You stayed. And that's where your power begins. Not in blaming them, but in reclaiming what you do next. The Stoics never promised a world without betrayal. They never said your heart would be safe. They only ever taught this. You don't control the wound, you control the meaning. And in that meaning, you control the healing. See, pain isn't the problem, pain is the messenger. The real problem is silence. Yours, when you don't speak your truth even to yourself. When you minimize your experience because they minimized it first. When you wait for them to give it a name so you can finally grieve. But let me ask you, if they never acknowledge your hurt, does that mean it wasn't real? Of course not. And if they never offer you closure, does that mean you don't deserve to move forward? Absolutely not. You've been conditioned to think healing requires their participation. It doesn't. They may have written the beginning of this chapter, but you're still holding the pen. And that means the ending is yours. So maybe it's time to name the wound yourself, not to relive it, but to stop pretending it didn't happen. Not to assign blame, but to give it shape. Because what you don't face owns you. What you don't name haunts you. And when a wound becomes a ghost, it starts showing up in places it doesn't belong. In new relationships, in job interviews, in quiet moments that should have been peaceful. You don't even realize it, but suddenly you're guarded, reactive, easily triggered. Not because you're damaged, but because no one ever taught you what to do when your heart breaks without a sound. So I'll tell you what the Stoics would say. You don't have to forgive them today. You don't have to be okay right now. You just have to stop abandoning yourself the way they did. Because healing doesn't begin when the wound closes. It begins when you stop pretending you're not hurt. When you stop numbing the ache with busyness or blame. When you look in the mirror and say, this hurt me, and that's okay, but it will not define me. That's clarity. That's power. That's the beginning of something unshakable. And if you're still asking, why me? You're not alone. That question has echoed through every soul that's ever been shattered by someone who didn't know what they held. But the answer isn't about them. It never was. It's not, why me? It's what now? And what do you do with the pain they left behind? What do you build with the rubble? What kind of fire do you light from the ashes? Because if they were careless with you, that says everything about them. but how you choose to rise. That says everything about you. If you've ever asked, why me? Stay, because the next chapter won't answer that question. It will make you never need to ask it again. Pain demands a response, but wisdom chooses the right one. There's a moment, raw and unfiltered, when someone wounds you, especially someone you once trusted, and the pain doesn't just arrive. It erupts, not quietly, not rationally, but violently within your inner world. And in that eruption, a voice rises, not the voice of reason, not the voice of reflection, but the ancient, primal cry of retaliation. Make them feel it. Let them hurt like they made you hurt. Let justice fall like thunder on their chest. And maybe for a moment that voice doesn't sound wrong. It sounds righteous. It sounds like justice. It sounds like dignity trying to fight its way back to the surface. But let's be brutally honest. What you truly want is not always revenge. It's recognition. You want them to see what they did. You want them to feel what you felt. You want them to realize with a jolt of clarity that they didn't just break a moment. They broke a part of you that trusted without armor. What you're truly aching for isn't vengeance. It's equilibrium. They lied. They dismissed. They ghosted. They twisted your words until you started questioning your own reality. And then they walked away like none of it ever happened, like you were just a scene in a movie they didn't care to finish. And so you're left with this deep emotional imbalance. You showed up with sincerity. They met you with strategy. You gave vulnerability. They returned confusion. You brought your truth, and they weaponized silence. So of course your mind demands balance. It wants to settle the equation. Because the weight is lopsided, and part of you still believes that maybe, just maybe, if they felt what you felt, the scales would tip back toward justice. But here's the bitter truth that Stoic philosophy exposes without flinching. The scales don't tip that way. Not in the emotional realm, not when the other side doesn't care. The people who inflict the deepest wounds are often the least capable of acknowledging them. Not because the pain wasn't real, but because admitting it would force them to confront something they've spent their entire lives avoiding. Themselves. And they lack the emotional maturity to reflect. They lack the empathy to regret. And more often than not, they lack the courage to ever speak the words you're waiting to hear. So there you sit, holding your breath, waiting for the apology, waiting for the reckoning, waiting for the scene in your head to become real. The moment where they call, their voice trembling, and they finally say, I was wrong, I see it now, I'm sorry. But that scene rarely comes. And if it does, it often arrives far too late, or worse, without any real understanding. And the longer you wait for that moment, the more you chain your healing to a person who's already walked away. You tie your peace to their self-awareness. You make your freedom conditional on their remorse. And that right there is the most dangerous trap of all, because your healing is no longer about you, bae. It's become a negotiation, a silent contract where they hold the final signature. But Stoicism burns that contract. The Stoics called it the delusion of equivalence, the mistaken belief that peace can only be restored if pain is matched, if injustice is balanced with consequence, if the emotional account is paid in full. But peace doesn't come from retribution. It doesn't come from symmetry. It comes from sovereignty. Because the more you invest energy into making them understand, the more of your soul you drain in the process. Every mental debate, every rehearsed confrontation, every invisible conversation you carry with you into the shower, into your sleep, into your silence, it all bleeds from your emotional reservoir, and none of it moves you forward. And yet still there's the fantasy, the perfect comeback, the poetic revenge, the scene where they finally fall apart. But here's the question Stoicism dares to ask. Do you want them to suffer, or do you want yourself back? Because you can't have both. Revenge might feel powerful in your imagination, but in reality it keeps you tied to the one thing that hurt you most, their existence. It forces you to orbit them, to measure your strength by their recognition, to place your healing in a future where they finally get it. And even if that future came, what then? Would their regret erase the nights you couldn't breathe? Would their apology repair the version of you that silently unraveled? Would their breakdown rebuild your foundation? No, because true dignity isn't restored when they say sorry. It's restored the moment you realize you don't need them to. And that's where silence becomes the most terrifying response of all. Because silence means you're done. Not emotionally reactive, not waiting for closure, not dropping hints for recognition. Just done. And when you no longer react, you rob them of the one thing they counted on most, your continued engagement. When you stop explaining, they lose control. When you stop chasing, they lose access. When you stop needing to be understood, they become irrelevant. That's not weakness. That's war without a sword. That's you saying, I've stopped playing the game, because healing is not about justice anymore. It's about freedom. If you've ever stayed up wishing for the perfect thing to say, stay now, because in the next breath, you'll discover why the most powerful response is no response at all. True control is not visible. It's felt in what you withhold. There is a moment and a flashpoint in every emotional confrontation when someone pushes just hard enough to provoke a reaction. Whether through a carefully placed insult, a calculated silence, or a look that seems designed to belittle, what they want is rarely clarity. What they truly seek is movement, emotional, visible, disruptive movement from you. And when that moment hits, your nervous system lights up. Everything inside you wants to respond, to speak, to correct, to fight for your name, your truth, your version of what really happened. To shout, you don't get to twist this and walk away. You don't get to write the final line. But here is what most never realize in that heat. The moment you react, you concede the high ground. Not because you're wrong, but because you've allowed them to set the emotional tempo. You let them pull you from center, and now you're playing by their rules. That's where Stoicism offers something far more potent than a sharp comeback. You don't win by striking back. You win by becoming untouchable. You win by refusing to move. Not out of indifference, but from a place of deep internal sovereignty. You win when your emotions no longer rise and fall according to their provocations. You win when they bait, insult, and twist, and you stay still. Not cold, not passive, still, so in the way a mountain stays still during a storm. Because power, the real kind, is never loud. It's not measured in decibels. It doesn't come wrapped in rage. It's not in the person yelling across the room. It's not in the paragraph-long message you'll regret sending. And it's certainly not in the sarcastic jab that buys you 10 seconds of satisfaction in days of emotional fallout. Power is presence. Power is stillness. Power is a kind of terrifying calm, the kind that tells the other person, your chaos has no influence here. Now that doesn't mean apathy. It doesn't mean emotional suppression or pretending you don't feel the sting. It means this: you feel it fully, you breathe through it, and you choose not to hand it back to them wrapped in reaction. That's the internal war Stoicism teaches us to win, not the war with others, but the war with our own ego. Because the ego always wants the last word. It wants to be seen. It wants vindication. It wants to win. But the wiser part of you, the part trained in discipline, awareness, and restraint, knows that victory isn't found in verbal duels. It's found in choosing not to play a game that was rigged from the start. When you react, you show them they still hold a piece of you, that they still have access, that they still rent space in your mind. And anyone who seeks control over you doesn't need to dominate you directly. They just need your response. That's why manipulators use bait, why narcissists sow confusion and guilt, why emotionally chaotic people keep the fire alive with half-truths and insinuations. They don't care about facts. They care about your energy. And when you stop giving it to them, when you stop replying, explaining, clarifying, defending, their strategy begins to collapse. Because now they're standing in the ring alone, swinging at shadows. And that silence, that dignified stillness, it becomes the loudest message they'll ever receive. It tells them, I am no longer where you left me. I've taken back access to my peace. I have nothing left to prove and everything to protect. This is what Stoics mean when they speak of detachment. Not a numbing of the soul, but the disciplined decision to no longer leak energy into emotional holes that go nowhere. Not every insult requires a counterpunch. Not every accusation deserves a trial. Not every provocation must be met with explanation. You are not obligated to keep explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. And yes, your silence may be misinterpreted. They might call you cold. They may say you gave up. They may brand you distant, uncaring, arrogant. Let them. That's the beauty of true inner strength. You no longer need to be understood by those who never intended to understand you. You didn't stop engaging because you lacked words. You stopped because you realized they didn't deserve the energy it takes to speak them. You're not withholding to punish. You're conserving to preserve. And that's the difference between reaction and regulation. Reaction gives them control. Regulation gives you peace. So next time they try to draw you into the same old storm, pause some of our laws. Not because you're afraid to fight, but because you've realized the battle was never worth winning. Because winning the war is not about silencing them. It's about never letting them move you again. You don't need to explain that you've outgrown their game. You don't even need to tell them you've left the board. Just hold your ground, say nothing, and let them stumble on the absence of the chaos they once depended on. You don't need the door to be closed when you've already walked away from the building. It often doesn't hit you in the heat of the moment. It comes later, sometimes days, weeks, even years after the final message was read, after the last silence was sent. You find yourself staring at an old text thread, maybe just out of habit, maybe out of hope. You scroll slowly. You linger on that last exchange. You wonder, will they ever say something else? Something that makes this all make sense? That's the silent hunger we rarely name. We don't call it what it is. We say we want closure, but what we really want is redemption. Not for them, for ourselves. We want to know that what we felt was real, that we weren't crazy, that we weren't overly sensitive or too intense, that our version of the story mattered, that our pain meant something. We want them to look back and say, you were right, you didn't deserve that, I see it now. And somehow that imagined moment becomes our anchor. It keeps us circling, looping, replaying, rationalizing. Not because we want to go back, but because we want them to own it before we leave for good. But Stoicism doesn't leave room for that fantasy. It dismantles it with precision. It teaches this: closure is not a gift they can give. It is a decision you must make. You've been taught to believe that the person who created the chaos is the one most qualified to offer clarity. But that's like asking a storm to explain why it destroyed your house. It doesn't have the vocabulary. And even if it did, would its explanation bring back what was lost? If they had the emotional depth to offer you closure, they likely wouldn't have wounded you in the first place. The truth is simple and painful. The ones who harm you the most are often the least equipped to acknowledge that harm. And yet, we wait. We wait not because we're weak, but because a part of us still believes they hold the key to our healing. That if they just said the right thing, if they just saw it, something inside us would unlock and the pain would finally leave. But that's the trap. Closure becomes a leash, one disguised as logic. It gives us a reason to stay mentally tied to people who've long since detached from us emotionally. We tell ourselves it's unfinished, incomplete, that there must be one more conversation, one final moment to complete the story. But here's the truth Stoicism gives us, unflinching and pure. You don't need their words to end the chapter. You need your own understanding. That's the difference between closure and clarity. Closure is external. Clarity is internal. Closure depends on their growth. Clarity depends on your courage. Closure is waiting. Clarity is walking. Closure begs, please help me make sense of this. Clarity declares, I may never understand, but I will move forward anyway. Imagine this. Closure is standing in the rain outside a locked door, holding a key that no longer fits, hoping someone inside eventually opens it. Clarity is turning away from that door, soaked maybe, trembling even, but finally walking toward the road that leads somewhere new. It's not easy. You'll still ache. You'll still wish things had ended differently. You might still dream of the version of the story where they came back and made it right. But clarity isn't the absence of grief. It's the presence of direction. Because the truth is, their reasons, if they even gave them, wouldn't soothe you. They'd only complicate what you already know. You don't need their version. You need to trust your own experience. You were there, you felt it. You watched them choose distance. You watched them rewrite the script while you still clung to the original. And still the mind asks, but why? But that question is not your liberation, it's your imprisonment. Because even if they told you, I was scared, I wasn't ready, I didn't know how to love you, would it make it easier to carry the silence they left behind? Probably not, because understanding does not always bring peace. Sometimes not knowing is the only gift you can give yourself. Because in that not knowing, you're forced to write your own meaning. And that's what Stoicism is about. Not assigning blame, but reclaiming authorship. So instead of asking, why did they hurt me? Ask, what did I ignore? What did I tolerate? What part of me believed this was the best I could receive? Because that's where your power lives. Not in their answers, but in your questions. Not in their apology, but in your awareness. Clarity isn't a grand moment. It's subtle. It arrives when you stop needing closure to breathe. It arrives when you look back and realize you don't miss them. You miss the version of you who hadn't seen the truth yet. But now you have. Now you see. And now you no longer have to wait for the final word to come, because you've already written it yourself. If you're still holding space for their explanation, pause. Because what if the silence they left behind isn't an unfinished sentence, but the end of a chapter they were never meant to finish? Some wounds don't break you, they forge you. There's a particular kind of pain, one you might recognize by its unmistakable resonance. It's a kind of ache that doesn't merely sting at the surface, doesn't just cause momentary distress, but seeps deeper beneath the layers of your identity. This pain doesn't simply pass through you. It reshapes you, bends you, and molds you in ways you didn't know were possible. It's not the type of pain you asked for, not something you deserved or earned. And yet, here it is, a gift wrapped harshly in betrayal, loss, and silence. Life has an uncanny way of handing you fires you never lit yourself, but still must learn to stand in. A fire of rejection, a flame of abandonment, an inferno of shattered trust. And so there you stand, perhaps at this very moment, in the blistering heat of an experience you didn't invite. Your spirit bent under the weight of it. Your heart struck repeatedly by invisible blows. Your voice silent, either out of shock, disbelief, or sheer exhaustion from trying to explain something no one seems capable of understanding. But even in that brutal moment, there is a subtle and quiet miracle happening. You are bending, but you are not breaking. Pain like this, real, soul-deep pain, isn't always a signal of destruction. Sometimes it's the unmistakable echo of a hammer striking hot iron. And you are the blade. Not yet sharp, perhaps, not yet polished, but unquestionably taking form. Consider the blacksmith for a moment, standing silently over his forge, watching as the steel turns glowing red under immense heat. Each strike of his hammer is deliberate. Each impact is calculated and purposeful. If the metal could speak, it would beg him to stop. It would plead for relief. Yet each blow doesn't bring ruin. It delivers strength. Each strike isn't punishment, it's purpose. This is exactly how Stoicism reframes pain. Stoics never romanticize suffering, nor do they suggest that hardship is something to celebrate blindly. Instead, Stoicism looks directly into the fiery heart of pain and says, if I must endure this, then let it shape me into something even stronger than what tried to destroy me. Imagine then if the betrayal you suffered wasn't simply cruelty. What if it was a catalyst? Imagine if the silence they left you with wasn't emptiness, but rather a necessary space for profound clarity. Imagine if the heartbreak that felt like the end wasn't a conclusion at all, but rather the beginning of a version of you that could only be born from this heat. This right here is where you must pause and recognize a fundamental distinction. There is pain that simply defines you, holding you captive to the past, and there is pain that reveals you, illuminating your potential future. The only difference between these outcomes is not found in the source of pain, but in your response to it. Most people experience pain passively. They merely endure it. They grit their teeth, shut their eyes, and wait desperately for it to pass. Passive endurance, though, doesn't transform you. It merely prolongs suffering. Passive endurance waits for someone else's apology, someone else's change, someone else's validation. But purposeful suffering is entirely different. Purposeful suffering is a form of inner alchemy. It's a choice, a fierce declaration from deep within that says, I refuse to let this moment be wasted. I refuse to carry the pain forward as a burden. Instead, I will turn it into something powerful, something valuable, something unbreakable. Because the truth is, every heartbreak holds lessons that peaceful days could never teach you. Every manipulation reveals exactly where your boundaries were too permeable. Every bitter disappointment points out precisely where your standards needed elevation. Every wound, every scar, these aren't simply remnants of your past. They're maps of your resilience, proof of survival, silent testimonies of your evolution. This kind of growth isn't comfortable. It's not meant to be easy. Growth hurts, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Just as muscles tear before they strengthen, just as knowledge feels heavy before it enlightens, just as a heart trembles before it learns to trust again. This isn't weakness, it's resistance meeting refinement. It's raw material transforming under pressure into something invaluable and enduring. The Stoic never crumbles beneath the blows of life. He calibrates his response. He doesn't sit around asking, why did this happen to me? Instead, he courageously asks, what is this here to teach me? He doesn't lament, this isn't fair. Instead, he calmly asserts, this will become my fuel. He doesn't plead to be rescued. Instead, he builds an inner fortress, one so stable, so rooted in self-awareness, that no external storm can dismantle it. If you find yourself still in the forge, still feeling the intense heat, still hearing the steady strike of life's hammer, understand clearly, this is not punishment. This is process. This is refinement. You are not broken. You are actively becoming something stronger, something wiser, something infinitely more capable. Yes, it's painful, but pain with purpose is the price paid by those committed to growth. Every moment you feel this heat, every breath you take under pressure, you grow, you expand, you solidify your core, you become someone new, someone who perhaps no longer fits into old boxes, outdated relationships, or limited beliefs. Because those who thought their actions would break you, they didn't realize their blows were exactly what it took to shape you. They didn't understand that every strike, every moment of silence, every piece of your heart they discarded was forging you into a blade sharper, stronger, and far more dangerous. Because now your power isn't found in reaction. It's found in the unshakable strength of knowing exactly what you've endured. They believed striking you down would destroy you. They never imagined that each strike was precisely how the sword is shaped, tempered, and sharpened. I didn't leave because I stopped caring. I left because I finally understood. After you've stood long enough in the forge of your own transformation, after the strikes of pain and the heat of betrayal have shaped you into something new, something stronger, something clearer, there inevitably comes a moment of profound stillness. It arrives quietly, without fanfare, and settles like a soft exhale after years of holding your breath. In that stillness, a truth emerges that you perhaps once feared, misunderstood, or resisted. The need to step away is no longer a question. It's a quiet, unshakable knowing. You realize that walking away isn't about making a statement or leaving a mark. It's simply about reclaiming what was always yours. Your center, your equilibrium, your peace. And yet, detachment is so often misunderstood. People around you, though still entangled in dramas of ego, validation, and conflict, will assume you've grown cold. They'll misinterpret your silence as bitterness, your distance as resentment, your calm as emotional shutdown. But they're wrong. Real detachment doesn't spring from anger or hatred. It springs from the purest clarity, a sudden, undeniable awakening. You didn't detach because you ceased to care. If anything, you finally began caring deeply enough about yourself to see the patterns clearly. You saw precisely how often you shrunk to accommodate someone else's insecurities. You saw every boundary you allowed to dissolve, every line you crossed, every fragment of your truth you silenced to maintain harmony with people who thrived in chaos. You saw clearly, for the first time, how love, real love, could never demand you make yourself smaller. And in that moment, leaving was no longer abandonment. It was a declaration of sovereignty. Stoicism never demands you stop feeling or caring. What it does demand is something far harder but infinitely wiser. That you stop bleeding yourself dry for people who refuse to acknowledge the wounds they inflict. You can still hold space for compassion in your heart. You can wish them peace, happiness, even healing. You can still honor the memories you shared, the laughter, the quiet moments, the genuine connection. Yet you can do all of this while closing the chapter decisively, without the need to reread the final page hoping something will change. This is not cruelty. This is clarity. There's a profound elegance in leaving without spectacle. No explosive exits, no dramatic ultimatums, no passive-aggressive goodbyes. Stoicism teaches that true departure is quiet and deliberate. It's firm, yet subtle. It's absolute, yet understated. You don't need cryptic final words, hoping that they'll suddenly understand the pain they refuse to acknowledge when it mattered most. You just leave, calmly, confidently, finally. Not because you hate them, not because you want revenge, but because you've stopped betraying yourself for their comfort. Detachment doesn't mean pushing people away or cutting yourself off from feeling. Instead, it's simply the decision to stop tearing yourself apart just to create room for their chaos. It's choosing to stop endlessly explaining, justifying, and proving your worth to those who were never capable of understanding it from the start. Yes, it will be difficult. It may be the hardest thing you've ever done. You will likely second-guess yourself. You'll replay conversations, retracing every step, wondering if you've been too harsh, too cold, too distant. Your mind might tempt you with narratives of doubt, whispering, maybe I could have done more. Maybe I should give them another chance. But pause and ask yourself honestly, if staying continues to cost you your peace, is it truly connection or simply emotional debt? Because genuine connection never requires continuous sacrifice of your core identity. True connection strengthens your boundaries. It doesn't erase them. What you're choosing now isn't emotional shutdown. It's a spiritual leveling up. You're stepping away from old patterns that no longer fit the truth of who you have become. You're releasing the toxic habit of offering endless access to those who mistake kindness for entitlement. You're no longer shrinking yourself down to remain palatable to those who only love the version of you without edges or boundaries. This detachment is not an act of running away. It's a revolutionary act of returning. But returning to the parts of yourself that remember what stillness feels like. Returning to the quiet center that doesn't spiral into anxiety at every unanswered message or unreturned phone call. Returning to the innate knowledge that peace isn't found by desperately waiting to be chosen. It's cultivated by decisively choosing yourself. And when others, confused or unsettled by your newfound clarity, inevitably ask why you walked away, you won't feel the need to explain or justify. Because there's nothing to explain when your soul simply chooses to breathe again without restriction. They may never understand your decision. They might label you distant, aloof, even selfish. But the Stoic truth remains unshaken. You don't owe explanations to those who showed no interest when your heart cried out for understanding. Your silent departure, your quiet strength, these need no defense. You are not escaping anyone or anything. You are returning home, home to a place within yourself where their power, their case, their confusion can no longer reach. You have rediscovered an inner sanctuary that was always yours, one you temporarily abandoned in pursuit of external validation. But now you've reclaimed it, permanently. You're not running from them. You're returning to the place where their influence no longer holds sway. That place is your true home. Forgiveness isn't an open door. It's the final lock before you walk away for good. People often misunderstand forgiveness. They look at it and see surrender, weakness, or worse, an invitation to re-enter your life. They assume that forgiveness must mean reconciliation, that releasing the weight of resentment is equivalent to inviting someone back to the space they once damaged. But this couldn't be further from the truth. Forgiveness, in its most genuine form, isn't even about the person who wronged you. It's not about absolving them of responsibility or pretending the pain never existed. It's not an act of generosity toward them. It's an act of liberation for you. When you forgive someone, you aren't declaring them innocent or harmless. You aren't rewriting history or excusing their behavior. You are making a silent, powerful declaration of independence, an emotional revolution that quietly says, I refuse to carry the burden of your choices. Not because what you did wasn't harmful, but precisely because my peace matters more. Forgiveness is your declaration of freedom. Freedom from reliving the betrayal in your mind every night. Freedom from holding on to anger as if it's the only evidence left of your worth. Freedom from waiting for their understanding or validation to finally move forward. Forgiveness doesn't build bridges, it sets boundaries. Boundaries that say clearly, I release the bitterness, but I will never forget the lesson. I've let go of the hurt, but I've kept the wisdom. Forgiveness without boundaries isn't kindness, it's self-neglect. It's extending mercy without safeguarding your own well-being. On the other hand, boundaries without forgiveness aren't strength either. They are hardened scars, unhealed wounds hidden behind walls that prevent your growth. Genuine healing requires both forgiveness and boundaries, each one incomplete without the other. Stoicism has never encouraged denial of pain or pretending that suffering never happened. Instead, it provides the courage to acknowledge the wound openly and then refuse to be controlled by it. It's about consciously cutting the emotional rope that still tethers you to the past. It means emptying the heavy backpack of resentment you've carried into every new room, every new conversation, and every potential relationship. It means acknowledging your hurt openly and honestly, but refusing to be imprisoned by it. Yes, they betrayed you. Yes, they hurt you deeply. Yes, what happened was unjust, unfair, and undeserved. But every day you relive that injustice in your mind, every moment you let resentment play on repeat, you hand over more control to the very person who inflicted the pain. That's the ultimate tragedy, not the betrayal itself, but the endless loop of resentment that follows you long after the act itself is over. Forgiveness is your intentional choice to break that loop once and for all. It's the clear decision to say, I no longer demand accountability from someone who was never capable of it in the first place. And let's be crystal clear on this. Forgiving someone doesn't mean inviting them back into your life. You can forgive and still block them. You can forgive and still delete their messages. You can forgive and never share space with them again. Forgiveness is not conditional on reunion. It requires nothing more than recognizing one fundamental truth. You have grown beyond the person you once were. You are no longer someone who needs pain as a teacher. You've graduated from the lesson they provided, no longer dependent on suffering as proof of your worth or resilience. When they inevitably return, and they often do, they'll come armed with apologies, carefully rehearsed explanations, tearful realizations. I've changed. I didn't realize what I had. You were always the one. In those moments, it's human to hesitate, to wonder, to consider whether this time might truly be different, but hold steady in your wisdom. Understand clearly, just because you've healed doesn't mean they've evolved. Your growth is not evidence of their transformation. It's evidence of your own strength, your own courage, your own clarity. If they return after the promises, the apologies, the tears, pause. But pause not to entertain their explanations. Pause to remember this crucial truth. Forgiveness wasn't your bookmark. It wasn't placed there to mark a page you'd later return to. It was a decisive act of closure. The door you once kept open out of love out of loyalty, out of hope, that door no longer exists. You didn't merely close it gently, leaving space for future uncertainty. You bricked up the frame. You moved away from the foundation they weakened. You planted new seeds of peace and self-respect exactly where their chaos once stood. You are not cold, you are clear. You are not cruel, you are conscious. And your peace, your newfound clarity and freedom, is never again negotiable. If they ever come back after their apologies and promises, remember this. You may have forgiven them, but the door they once walked through is now completely gone. And that is exactly as it should be. Some losses are too quiet to notice until it's far too late. The reality of growth, of truly moving beyond the chapters of your life that once held so much pain, is rarely cinematic. You don't always receive that moment of clarity from those who wounded you. There's no dramatic scene where they suddenly drop a glass in shock, whispering your name as regret floods their eyes. No climactic realization at midnight. No desperate phone call asking for forgiveness. No, usually the recognition, if it ever arrives, comes quietly. It comes subtly, sneaking up on them long after you've already left the stage. It arrives when they finally notice the absence of your laughter, your compassion, your steady presence, an absence they once took entirely for granted. But by then, it's always too late. Because the person they once hurt, the version of you who allowed your boundaries to blur and your self-worth to shrink, that person no longer exists. You didn't vanish, you transformed. You evolved through fire and silence, emerging quietly but resolutely stronger. The person who remains is one they've never met, a version of you forged not by their validation, but by the sheer power of your own self-awareness. And this new version of you doesn't require their recognition. You no longer wait for their acknowledgement of your worth because you've discovered something powerful. Genuine self-worth never needs external approval. The moment you realize your value depends on no one's agreement but your own, you stop negotiating your place in anyone else's life. You simply leave quietly and without bitterness. You've stepped into a life now where your presence is no longer a given, freely offered as proof of your kindness or tolerance. Instead, it's a carefully protected privilege, reserved only for those who truly appreciate its significance. And that, precisely, is the transformation they'll never fully comprehend. To them, your departure appears sudden, confusing, perhaps even cold. They might say you've changed, as though growth and change are somehow faults rather than triumphs. They may whisper to others that you gave up too easily or disappeared without reason. They might label your new silence as detachment, your calmness as selfishness, your clarity as cruelty. But all these labels are merely attempts to rewrite a narrative that preserves their comfort, protecting their ego from confronting an uncomfortable truth. The truth that you finally understood your own worth and refused to compromise it any longer. Deep down, though they'll never openly admit it, what they truly feel is the heaviness of your absence. It's a silent void, an empty space they once filled effortlessly with your compassion and availability. They'll sense the vacancy of a heart that used to adapt endlessly to their emotional demands, the lack of a presence that once patiently waited to be acknowledged, even while it was constantly overlooked. Your quiet disappearance isn't punishment. It's not an act of revenge. It's simply the natural consequence of your growth, a peaceful yet powerful withdrawal of your energy, your kindness, your tolerance for situations and people who took these gifts for granted. Your absence speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. It delivers a silent lesson more profound than any explanation you could ever give. Respect and appreciation are not infinite resources. They must be nurtured and valued, or they inevitably fade away. When you left, it wasn't a reaction fueled by bitterness or resentment. You didn't exit with anger burning your bridges behind you. Instead, you moved forward with wisdom, quietly building boundaries around yourself, not to punish or spite, but to honor the integrity of your soul. You understood, perhaps for the first time, that you could no longer afford to sacrifice your well-being in hopes that someone else would finally recognize it. Your departure was never a singular moment. It was an evolution, It was the gradual and deliberate removal of your emotional availability from situations that drained you, rather than replenished you. And the boundaries you've built now stand tall, not out of hostility, but as monuments to your own self-respect. They may never fully grasp this transformation, because recognizing it would require a level of self-awareness they were never willing to cultivate. It would demand an honesty they chose never to embrace. But you chose differently. You chose growth, clarity, and self-respect over the temporary comfort of false acceptance. So let them sit quietly with your absence. Let them wonder why the door they used to open so casually no longer exists. Let them grapple with questions they'll never dare to ask aloud. While they do, you'll be elsewhere, peacefully becoming someone stronger, wiser, someone who would never return to the emotional places that once tried to diminish you. Your absence requires no explanation, because your presence was always a privilege, and now that privilege is reserved solely for those who understand its value. You don't win the war by conquering your enemy. You win by realizing you no longer need to fight. Emotional battles are unlike physical ones. They don't end with flags planted or victory clearly defined. There's no triumphant march, no moment of indisputable clarity where one party admits total defeat. These battles, hidden beneath the surface of interactions, driven by ego, cloaked in confusion and disguised as love or loyalty, rarely yield clear winners or definitive endings. The truth about emotional warfare is that it doesn't end when someone is proven right or wrong. It doesn't end because logic finally triumphs or because justice ultimately prevails. These battles cease only when one person finally awakens to the reality of what's really happening, when one person sees through the point beyond the surface, past the illusion. They recognize the fight not as a noble cause, but as a senseless game orchestrated by ego, insecurity, and unresolved wounds. Real victory is subtle, quiet, and almost always unseen. You don't win these internal wars when your opponent acknowledges their wrongdoings or admits defeat. You don't win when you've successfully dismantled their arguments with razor-sharp comebacks or exposed them publicly for all to see. Victory isn't dragging someone's name through the dirt, hoping everyone finally understands your pain. True victory is simpler, yet infinitely more powerful. It occurs the very moment your inner peace becomes more important than making your point. It arrives precisely when you stop feeling the compulsive need to prove yourself, to explain your stance, or to justify your experience. Victory is the profound realization that you could destroy, could expose, could retaliate, and yet you deliberately choose not to. And that choice, it's anything but weakness. It's absolute control. In a culture where confrontation and one-upmanship are often glorified, where people feel compelled to respond publicly to every slight insult or accusation, restraint is radical. Anyone can react impulsively. Anyone can weaponize the truth and hurl it like a grenade, hoping it explodes loudly enough to silence their adversary. But authentic strength doesn't manifest in reckless retaliation. Authentic strength reveals itself when you have every reason, every justification, every capability to retaliate, yet you consciously and calmly choose peace instead. Only the truly grounded individual, rooted deeply in self-awareness, possesses the ability to unsheathe the sword and consciously decide never to swing it. This restraint, this deliberate decision, is precisely where Stoicism reveals its fiercest, most formidable edge. The Stoic never argues with fools because he recognizes that logic has no impact on those who thrive in irrationality. He doesn't chase emotional chaos because he understands it's a never-ending pursuit leading only to exhaustion. He doesn't attempt to win over those who have already demonstrated clearly that fairness and honesty were never part of their intentions. Why? Because he knows this fundamental truth. You don't play chess against someone who overturns the board the moment they're losing. You don't wrestle shadows that offer no resistance. You don't trade your dignity, your integrity, or your inner peace simply to prove that you could overpower someone who has no genuine desire for understanding or resolution. Instead, you rise above. You gather your strength, not in vocal declarations or dramatic exits, but in quiet, deliberate departure. You don't slam doors to mark your exit. You simply and peacefully remove your energy, your attention, and your emotional investment from the space where conflict once existed. Because what toxic people want most is never understanding or resolution. It's your emotional reaction, your continued investment, your participation in the endless cycle of blame, justification, and retaliation. They depend entirely on your involvement in their chaos. When you refuse to offer that, when you consciously withhold your engagement and emotional energy, they're left alone, struggling and confused, grasping at shadows, swinging desperately at empty space. Your absence, your silence becomes the defeat they never anticipated or prepared for. We often mistakenly think power is demonstrated through visible dominance, loud confrontations, or obvious victories. But real power, stoic power, is invisible and quiet. It makes no grand announcements. It needs no validation or applause. It seeks no revenge. True power simply recognizes clearly and calmly when a battle no longer serves your growth or inner peace. It sees the futility of the fight and chooses deliberately to exit. This kind of victory does not require the other side to recognize they've lost. It doesn't demand their understanding or acknowledgement. Because the moment you no longer need them to understand, to apologize, or to validate your experience, you've already won. Real victory, profound, lasting victory, is leaving a war that offers nothing worth fighting for. It's walking away from the battlefield without bitterness or regret, fully understanding that your inner peace is infinitely more valuable than any fleeting satisfaction gained from proving yourself right. And in that departure, you become truly untouchable. If you've ever felt the urge to strike back, learn instead to draw your sword and hold it steady without ever swinging. Because true warriors know when to walk away unprovoked, undefeated, and entirely untouchable. Victory isn't in being remembered. It's in no longer needing to be. There comes a moment, and not with fireworks or applause, but in the stillness of your own heart, when you realize the fight is over. Not because someone surrendered, not because they finally apologized, but because you simply stopped needing anything from them at all. Not their validation, not their regret, not even their memory. You've grown so far beyond the space where they once held power that even if they called today and said, "I see it now," it wouldn't move you. Not because you're numb, but because you're finally whole, and that is the final blow. Not loud, not theatrical, but absolute. The version of you who used to crave clarity, to recheck their words, to rehearse what you'd say if given one last chance to be understood. That version is gone, and in their place stands someone no longer performing, no longer explaining, no longer aching for someone else's awareness. Because here's the truth. They don't need to know what they lost for you to know what you gained. And you gained yourself. The one they tried to mold, the one they tried to guilt, the one they overlooked, underestimated, or abandoned. You're no longer trapped in their emotional orbit, no longer circling the same questions, the same hope, no longer asking, "Do they think of me?" Because the answer no longer matters. Freedom is not silence. Freedom is not needing the silence to be heard. You don't need to be remembered. You don't need to be missed. You don't even need to be seen by the person who once closed their eyes when you stood right in front of them. Because your value was never tied to their perception, and your healing was never dependent on their understanding. They were part of the story, yes, but they were never the ending. You don't need to post the glow up. You don't need the cryptic quote. You don't need mutual friends to report back that they still think about you. That need, that residue of emotional entanglement, it's gone. And that is how you know you've truly won. No noise, no announcement, no burning bridge behind you, just a road ahead they'll never be invited to walk, because they no longer hold any part of you. And that is the power. If there's still something in you that wants them to see, to understand, to regret, then you're not free yet. Let your silence be the final sentence, one that needs no reader, no applause, and no reply. You made it here not just through the words, but through the weight of everything behind them. That says something about you. It says you're not just reading, you're remembering, rebuilding, rising. You've endured what many don't survive. Not the pain itself, but the silence after. The questions, the unraveling, the quiet awakening that follows when you finally realize no one is coming to rescue you, but you came. You stood up, you kept walking, and now you're not healing to prove anything. You're healing because you finally see your life as something sacred. Because you know your presence is no longer free. Because the war is over and your peace is non-negotiable. Here on True Stoic Way, we walk that quiet path with you. We don't scream, we don't chase, we master the self, and we rebuild in silence. One breath, one choice, one truth at a time. If this message spoke to something you couldn't quite name but always felt, then you're not alone. You're home. Subscribe to join the quiet ones who no longer fight to be seen because they've already seen themselves.